Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Future Is Degrowth, a guide to a world beyond capitalism, by Matthias Schmelzer, Andrea and Vansintjan. Narrated by Ulf Bjorklund. Preface. Over the last 15 years, degrowth has made significant contributions. It has helped to politicize the debate on sustainability and development, question green growth and technologically focused futurism, strengthen utopian alternatives, and bring together social movements, academics, and those engaged in the solidarity economy and civil society. During times of intense and continuous crisis, the degrowth community has become a gathering place for people who are seeking answers to how we got in this mess in the first place and how we can get out of it. This book describes the debates that have happened within this community and relays them to a wider audience. This is an expanded version of an original German book first published in 2019, Degrowth, Postwachstum zur Einführung, written by Matthias Schmelzer and Andrea. For the English version, we worked with Vansintjan to extend it to an international audience, changing it significantly in terms of structure, argumentation, and content. Degrowth thinkers, following feminist theories of science, point out that there can be no neutral science, but that the production of knowledge is always bound to a specific location. This introduction has been written by 3 politically engaged academics who are part of a wider community, the members of which have shaped and transformed our thinking. Even so, in this book we have sought to balance a thorough and fair representation of degrowth with a critical engagement with those same ideas. We hope that we have succeeded in this effort. We hope that this book can be an inspiration to think differently about today and tomorrow, to continue researching ways beyond growth, and to strengthen social movements that aim at building a future for all beyond capitalism. Matthias Schmelzer, Andrea and Vansintjan, Berlin and Montreal, December 2021. 1. Introduction. In April 2020, a group of academics in the Netherlands wrote a manifesto for a post-pandemic recovery. This manifesto, with its 5 demands based on the principles of a little-known degrowth movement, gained widespread attention. In this moment of insecurity and destabilization, it pushed the degrowth agenda into Dutch mainstream media and the traditional corridors of power, and it was discussed on primetime television and in Parliament. The claim that the neoliberal and growth-based model of development underpins many of our current crises, including the coronavirus pandemic, resonated with many, as did the call for a strategy to reorient the conversation away from symptoms and towards underlying causes. The manifesto made 5 key policy proposals. 1. A move away from development focused on aggregate GDP growth. Economic growth is conventionally measured as increase in gross domestic product, or GDP. To differentiate between sectors that can grow and need investment, the so-called critical public sectors, clean energy, education, health, and more, and sectors that must radically degrow due to their fundamental unsustainability or their role in driving continuous and excessive consumption, especially private sector oil, gas, mining, advertising, and so forth. 2. An economic framework focused on redistribution, which establishes a universal basic income rooted in a universal social policy system, a strong progressive taxation of income, profits, and wealth, reduced working hours and job sharing, and which recognizes care work and essential public services such as health and education for their intrinsic value. 3. Agricultural transformation towards regenerative agriculture based on biodiversity conservation, sustainable and mostly local and vegetarian food production, as well as fair agricultural employment conditions and wages. 4. Reduction of consumption and travel, with a drastic shift from luxury and wasteful consumption and travel to basic, necessary, sustainable, and satisfying consumption and travel. 5. Debt cancellation, especially for workers and small business owners, and for countries in the global south, both from richer countries and international financial institutions. Whether these proposals really grasp the core of degrowth will become clear throughout the rest of this book. We feature them in full here to highlight how the economic crisis caused by the pandemic has shifted the conversation around economic growth. On the one hand, as illustrated by the Dutch example, and we will cite several others later on, a widespread feeling, encapsulated in the slogan that went viral, "We don't want to get back to normal, since normalcy was the problem," created a window of opportunity for degrowth ideas to become known and see more widespread support. On the other hand, and likely as a reaction to the increasing popularity of degrowth ideas, major newspapers, from Forbes to the Financial Times and The Spectator, started to publish opinion pieces that frontally attacked degrowth. These argued that the coronavirus crisis reveals the misery of degrowth, that degrowth would make the recession permanent, or that it would be a recipe for misery and disaster. And indeed, this is how many people initially understand degrowth, as a call for economic recession, austere lifestyles, romantic Luddism, as a reaction against progress. However, as we will argue throughout the book, recessions and what happened during the pandemic do not represent degrowth, far from it. So what is this idea that, at the height of the pandemic, sparked a debate about radical alternatives, as illustrated by the Dutch manifesto, and which also provoked intense reactions from the establishment, as illustrated by the ongoing wave of half-baked opinion pieces lambasting degrowth? Degrowth is a term that is increasingly mobilized by scholars and activists to criticize the hegemony of growth, and a proposal for a radical reorganization of society that leads to a drastic reduction in the use of energy and resources, and that is deemed necessary, desirable, and possible. Degrowth starts from the fact, demonstrated by an increasing number of studies, that further economic growth in industrialized countries is unsustainable, even if that growth is green or inclusive, or even as part of a transformative progressive agenda that massively invests in renewable energies and the sustainability transition. Industrialized countries cannot reduce their environmental impact, emissions, material throughput, etc., fast and sufficiently enough, while at the same time growing their economies. The transformation needed in industrialized countries, if they are to reduce their emissions and environmental impacts fast enough to leave space for the global south to develop, will also lead to reducing the size of global north economies. While this need for sufficiency, a reduction of the material throughput for the most affluent, or an end to overconsumption, may sound radical to many, it is increasingly common ground among ecologically oriented progressives. For example, Naomi Klein writes in her recent book that lays out the case for a Green New Deal. The bottom line is that an ecological crisis that has its roots in the overconsumption of natural resources must be addressed not just by improving the efficiency of our economies, but also by reducing the amount of material stuff that the wealthiest 20% of people on the planet consume. Degrowth claims that such a transformation in the global north is not only possible, but also desirable. It is feasible to live well without growth and to make society more just, democratic, and truly prosperous on the way. To do this, however, a fundamental political and economic reorganization of society is necessary, which aims at overcoming multiple structural growth dependencies inherent to the capitalist economy, from industrialized infrastructures to social systems to the ideological myths of growth societies. More specifically, degrowth can be defined as a democratic transition to a society that, in order to enable global ecological justice, is based on a much smaller throughput of energy and resources, that deepens democracy and guarantees a good life and social justice for all, and that does not depend on continuous expansion. Before explaining where degrowth comes from and what exactly it proposes, we start by situating ourselves in a particular moment, showing why degrowth has taken such a crucial place in the political landscape today. Why degrowth and not a Green New Deal? It has been noted for decades, but by now everybody can see it clearly. We live in a time of many and accelerating crises. Climate breakdown is breathing down our neck. Biodiversity is collapsing in ecosystems around the world, and many natural safety nets, water cycles, soil fertility, fish stocks, microbial diversity are unraveling. Civil war and natural disasters have ripped whole countries apart, sending millions of people to seek safety, only to be blocked by militarized borders. A pandemic has brought the global economy to a shuddering halt. Financial and economic crises roil the world roughly every decade. There is a resurgence of nationalist and racist electoral parties. Meanwhile, mass movements arise every year to demand change, blocking business as usual. While leaders have promised prosperity and a middle-class lifestyle for all decades ago, those standards of living are becoming less and less attainable for most, as high levels of stable employment tilt towards precarity and endemic unemployment. Which proposals might get us out of this mess? Here we find it useful to borrow a term from Immanuel Wallerstein, the world systems theorist. In the 2000s, during what we would now consider the heyday of neoliberalism and the corresponding global movements against it, Wallerstein suggested that there were two main political camps: the spirit of Davos, where the world's economic and political elites meet at the annual World Economic Forum, and the spirit of Porto Alegre, the birthplace of the World Social Forums, where the world's popular social movements come together. Today, these camps have been split into two poles each. On the Davos side, there are not only the globalists, many of whom are in favor of green capitalism, but also feudal authoritarians and neo-fascists, as represented in particular by Donald Trump in the United States, Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, and Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. The globalists recognize the reality of climate change and advocate ecological modernization and green growth. They think there is no need to fundamentally change the current system. We just need better technology, more efficiency, and the proper application of science and market mechanisms. Just replace what we have now with electric cars, carbon capture and storage, green appliances, and renewable and nuclear energy, and the problem is solved. Neo-fascists, by contrast, are more explicitly in favor of a kind of eco-apartheid. Close the borders to migrants fleeing ecological collapse and the ravages of capitalist globalization. Expand military powers to defend the privileges of those who have benefited from economic growth. Further entrench the global division of labor and accelerate the extraction of resources. What drives this reactionary idea is the willingness to change everything in order to preserve what is seen as a natural order of things. Ultimately, this proposal will lead to a world more unequal than the one that exists today, and will still cause the wide-scale collapse of the present system. Importantly, both camps, the globalists and the neo-fascists, favor growth. They just support different means to attain it. On the other side, the Porto Alegre camp also has two poles. On the one hand, there is progressive productivism, those parts of the left that, in the tradition of socialist and social democratic workers' movements, focus on growth, increases in technical productivity and redistribution, and that tend to prefer vertical forms of organization. Often these leftists argue for keeping existing technological infrastructure, but seek to make it more efficient and socially just through centralized and hierarchical state planning. Proposals for utopias based on overcoming work through productivity increases, or a fully automated luxury communism also fall in this camp. Let us call this left productivism. On the other hand, there are the libertarian movements and currents that strongly focus on self-organization from below, and that fundamentally question growth. We could call this left libertarianism. This pole positions itself against hierarchy and productivism, and seeks to fundamentally alter global relations towards a multipolar, post-growth internationalism. Today, degrowth has become one of the key reference points within left libertarianism in the global north, or, as put in a recent volume, within the mosaic of alternatives that fight for a good life beyond growth, industrialism, and domination. In the last half-decade, one phrase has been at the center of both controversies and potential alliances between the productivist and libertarian poles: the Green New Deal. Some watered-down versions of a Green New Deal or Green Deal are promoted by governments, international organizations, and the European Commission, which essentially boil down to the ecological modernization of capitalism. These would be considered green growth globalism, firmly placed in the Davos camp. But we are here only interested in the more transformative leftist variants, long a set of policies for transition upheld by Green Party candidates. The Green New Deal is increasingly becoming a cornerstone of radical environmental politics and also larger political parties, such as the Labour Party in the UK and parts of the Democratic Party in the United States. The basic proposal seeks, through public investment and regulations, to radically reduce fossil fuel consumption and transition to a fully renewable economy, while guaranteeing just working conditions and full employment, as well as vastly improved living conditions for all, and in particular for marginalized communities. Inspired by the New Deal carried out by U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt following the Great Depression in the 1930s, the idea is for a large-scale mobilization and public investment program of green Keynesianism that fundamentally restructures the economy. While at first sight it appears that there is stark opposition between these more transformative leftist Green New Deals and degrowth, we argue throughout the book that there are many overlaps and similarities, that there is a wide scope for learning from each other and for collaborations, and that degrowth offers an important corrective for existing Green New Deal proposals. Degrowth's particular strengths include its strong analysis of the biophysical metabolism of capitalism, the global justice and resource implications of ecological modernization, the ideological hegemony perpetuated by growth-based economics, and its advancement of more deeply transformative policy proposals for an economy based on autonomy, care, and sufficiency. What distinguishes degrowth most clearly from other socio-ecological proposals is the politicization of social metabolism and its ramifications for policy design. Degrowth shares with most programs of ecological modernization, and with the Green New Deals, the call for massive investments into rapidly building up the material infrastructures for a post-fossil society, from community-controlled renewable energy sources to democratically managed public transport networks, to retrofitted, social or collective housing, or to worker-owned industrial plants, such as for long-lasting, repairable, and recyclable consumer products. Similar to the outlook of Kate Aronoff, Alyssa Battistoni, Daniel A. Cohen, and Thea Riofrancos, in A Planet to Win, degrowth also calls for a last stimulus of green economic development in the short term, to build landscapes of public affluence, develop new political economic models, jump off the growth treadmill, break with capital, and settle into a slower groove. However, the degrowth analysis, which takes into account extensive research on climate injustice and the possibilities of decoupling emissions from economic growth, posits that this needs to be accompanied by an economy-wide transition beyond economic growth. These studies show that a Green New Deal with growth, even if temporary, will likely be not sustainable. Thus, while Green New Deal proposals tend to emphasize this investment push and the growth of everything sustainable, degrowth also, and at least as rigorously, puts the focus on the many things that will have to go. To bring about a globally just and sustainable economy, large areas of production and consumption will need to be dismantled, while other systems will need to be built in their place. In contrast to most Green New Deals, degrowth formulates active policies to achieve a selective downscaling and deaccumulation of those economic activities that cannot be made sustainable, contribute little use values, or are superfluous consumption. And these include things like advertising, planned obsolescence, bullshit jobs, private planes, fossil fuel, and defense industries. Degrowth claims that there is a need to reduce energy and material throughput to avoid ecological overshoot. Furthermore, the necessary policies that put a cap on emissions, rapidly curb fossil production, and end overconsumption will likely lead to a reduction of GDP. While this might not be bad in and of itself, as GDP is a highly problematic indicator, societies need to be prepared by reorganizing institutions so that they are no longer dependent on growth and accumulation. There is certainly a tension that needs to be addressed here, since Green New Deal platforms are either in favor of economic growth or vague on whether the goal is growth, even as they propose policies that will in fact spur economic expansion. So, how could the last stimulus of the Green New Deal be combined with more transformative policies? These policies should, on the one hand, aim at degrowing those areas of production and consumption that are related to excess energy, mass, and emissions, and, on the other hand, ensure that these investments do not merely stabilize an economic system built around growth and accumulation, but initiate its transformation. Furthermore, Green New Deal platforms have been criticized for simply continuing, rather than challenging, uneven neo-colonial relationships between industrialized countries and the rest of the world. For example, by expanding solar power and lithium battery storage technology, without taking apart the unequal relationships between rich countries buying lithium and poor countries mining it. The Green New Deal may just create new problems and entrench neocolonialism. Degrowth, we argue in this book, offers perspectives that should be productively integrated and critically adapted into progressive politics, including those of what has been proposed as a Green New Deal without growth. Proponents of degrowth are therefore not only faced with the challenge of organizing social majorities for a political project in the face of a shift to the right, which advocates growth-oriented authoritarianism, as well as the continued presence of fossil fuel-driven and green capitalism. It is also important to convince those who represent the spirit of Porto Alegre, but are also oriented towards productivism of the merits of a degrowth society. In this way, degrowth advocates must navigate the multiple political realities that arise through repeated crises of the capitalist system and people's responses to these. This book is one attempt at navigating these challenges. By showing how degrowth can respond to the crises we face, we seek not only to introduce the various critiques of growth and the vision, policies, and strategies of degrowth, but also make a case for a degrowth that specifically addresses capitalism and the societal hierarchies, and to argue why the left should support it. Where did degrowth come from? Criticism of economic growth is almost as old as the phenomenon of economic growth itself, but the term degrowth, as it is used today, can be traced to relatively recent beginnings. Let us take a short look at its history. Some traditions of growth criticism date back to the late 18th century and ranged from Luddite riots against the machines of industrialization to romantic unease with modernity or anti-colonial dissections of European civilization. Yet in the second half of the 20th century, changed public perceptions of the finiteness of resources on this planet also led to popular search and critiques of economic growth. The first report to the Club of Rome in 1972 initiated a global debate on the limits to growth, which has not yet subsided. The birth of the word décroissance, translated into English as degrowth, can also be dated back to the year 1972. The political theorist Andrea already asked at that time, is the Earth's balance, for which no growth or even degrowth of material production is a necessary condition, compatible with the survival of the capitalist system? Other intellectuals of the period influenced the early degrowth discussion. Particularly important was the Romanian-American mathematician and economist Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, who integrated an understanding of physics and thermodynamics into economic theory. The debate on growth at the time extended far beyond environmental movements and included governments of industrialized countries, trade unions, and anti-colonial debates about development. One aspect of current degrowth ideas has been, for example, articulated by U.S. revolutionary intellectuals and civil rights activists James and Grace Lee Boggs, who argued in 1974 that the revolution to be made in the United States will be the first revolution in history to require the masses to make material sacrifices rather than to acquire more material things. Because, they continue, these were acquired at the expense of damning over 1/3 of the world into a state of underdevelopment, ignorance, disease, and early death. Still, during this time, the term degrowth was rarely used, and did not become a frame for a wider set of ideas until much later. And with the end of the oil crisis and the rise of neoliberalism since the 1980s, broader criticism of economic growth receded into the background. This only changed in the early 2000s. At the height of the neoliberal pensée unique, Margaret Thatcher's "there is no alternative," and the hegemony of sustainable development in environmental debates, the claim that economic growth can be reconciled with sustainability, degrowth was formed as a political project to open up cracks for systemic alternatives. In 2002, a special issue of the French magazine Silence was published with the title Décroissance soutenable et conviviale, Sustainable and Convivial Degrowth. In the introduction of the issue, Bruno Clémenton and Vansintjan coined the term décroissance soutenable explicitly as a counter-term to sustainable development, the buzzword at the time. In pairing the words degrowth and sustainability, the authors highlighted the fact that ending the pursuit of growth should not point to collapse or recession, as the word degrowth may suggest to many, but to a democratic process of transformation to a more just, sustainable, and less material and energy-intensive society. And the reference to degrowth as convivial, a French term, based on Latin convivere, to live together, emphasized that it referred to a positive vision of the good life, defined by cooperative social interrelations with each other and with nature, a vision insisting that another world is indeed possible. In this new use of the term degrowth was both a provocation and a political proposal meant to challenge mainstream economic assumptions of development and to lay out a path for the future. Initially, it combined two intellectual strands. First, a socio-metabolic and thermodynamic analysis of capitalist growth, which highlighted the need for the countries of the global north to exit the irrational and unsustainable growth race and subvert the related hegemony of the growth paradigm that claimed GDP growth was good, imperative, and limitless. Second, the radical critiques of the post-development school of thought, which criticized capitalist development and the idea that progress requires growth as a misguided, destructive, and universalizing Western ideology. The term gained currency in France in the following years, especially through the work of French economist, philosopher, and critic of development, Serge Latouche. By 2008, the English term degrowth had received international attention, with the first International Degrowth Conference on Ecological Sustainability and Social Justice in Paris. From this point onwards, the degrowth concept spread from France to Spain, Italy, the rest of Europe, and beyond. In its origins, the movement was rooted in anarchist environmental groups, campaigns for car-free cities and against large-scale industrial infrastructure, as well as in local collective projects, such as collective housing groups and eco-villages. Yet it was the biannual international degrowth conferences which served as meeting points, places for discussion, and the slow formation of an international degrowth framework. In 2014, the fourth international conference in Leipzig attracted 3,000 participants. By 2020, the seventh international conference, held online due to the COVID-19 pandemic, attracted over 4,000 participants. Research on the subject has multiplied, with hundreds of peer-reviewed academic journal articles being published on the topic. Each year, degrowth summer schools organized by different institutes and collectives across Europe attract dozens and sometimes hundreds of participants. And the Global Degrowth Day in June is an opportunity for local organizations and initiatives to organize festivals and conferences around the world. While degrowth continues to be a largely academic and activist concept, the critique of growth as an overarching priority is gaining popularity in the public realm as well. While polls have to be taken...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?